The email arrived on my 60th birthday, as unexpected as a summer snowstorm. "Hello, Caroline. You don't know me, but I believe you knew my father, Daniel Morrison." I stared at those words on my screen, my morning coffee forgotten as a tide of memories washed over me. Daniel Morrison, a name I hadn't spoken aloud in 38 years, though it had echoed in my mind during quiet moments throughout my adult life. The email continued, "My name is Eliza Morrison. My father passed away last month, and while sorting through his belongings, I found letters from you dated 1985. I also found a journal where he wrote about you often, even in his final years. I believe you were important to him, and I'd like to understand this part of his life that you never shared with us. Would you be willing to speak with me?" My hands trembled as I read and reread those words. Daniel was gone. After nearly 4 decades of silence between us, any possibility of reconciliation had vanished. And now his daughter, a woman whose existence I'd never known about, was reaching out across time and loss to connect the fragments of her father's life. I closed my laptop without replying. This was too much to process on an ordinary Tuesday morning, birthday or not. I needed to think, to sort through the jumbled emotions this unexpected contact had stirred. Rising from my breakfast nook, I walked to the windows, overlooking the Pacific Ocean, the same expansive view that had comforted me through a divorce, raising 2 children alone, career upheavals, and now the quiet solitude of early retirement. Daniel Morrison, my first love. The summer of 1985 unfolded in my memory with cinematic clarity. Sun-drenched days on the Massachusetts coast, midnight conversations about philosophy and dreams, the bittersweet knowledge that September would separate us when I left for graduate school in California and he began his medical residency in Boston. "We'll make it work," he had promised, his gray eyes intense as we sat on the beach during our last night together. 2 years apart, then I'll join you in California. We'll build our life there together. I'd believed him with the profound certainty of 22. We wrote letters during those first months apart, long, passionate declarations filled with plans and promises, weekly phone calls despite the exorbitant long-distance charges. But gradually, the calls grew shorter, the letters less frequent. By Christmas, the strain of distance was fraying the edges of our connection. Then came my father's sudden heart attack in February. During those chaotic weeks of hospital vigils and funeral arrangements, Daniel's absence was a physical ache. He'd sent flowers, called when he could between grueling hospital shifts, but couldn't leave his residency to be with me. "I need you here," I'd said during one tearful call. "You know I would be there if I could," he'd responded, his voice weary. "But people's lives depend on me showing up. I can't just walk away." That moment, his choosing duty over me, crystallized something I couldn't articulate then. After my father's funeral, I wrote Daniel a letter ending our relationship. My words were harsh, accusations of selfishness, and failed promises that reflected my grief more than reality. He'd called repeatedly afterward, but I refused to answer. The final letter he sent remained unopened on my nightstand for weeks before I threw it away, still sealed during a particularly dark moment of resolve. And that was it. No further contact. I moved forward with my life, completed my PhD, married a colleague, had children, built a career as a marine biologist. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Daniel had married someone else, remained in Boston, become a respected cardiologist. Two lives that once seemed destined to intertwine instead ran parallel, never touching again. Until now, when his daughter's email had collapsed nearly 4 decades of separation into a single moment of reckoning. My son Michael called that evening to wish me happy birthday. "You sound distracted, Mom," he said after our brief conversation. "Everything okay?" I hesitated. Michael, at 34, had weathered his own romantic disappointments before finding happiness with his husband. He'd understand the complexity of old wounds better than most. "I heard from someone connected to my past today," I said carefully, "someone I once cared about deeply." "An ex?" Michael asked, immediately interested. "Before Dad?" "Yes, before your father. My first real love, actually." I hadn't spoken much about Daniel to my children. What would have been the point? "He died recently, and his daughter reached out to me." Wow. Michael was silent for a moment. "Are you going to respond?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It was a lifetime ago. We ended poorly." "But you're curious," he observed. I smiled despite myself. My son knew me well. "Yes, I'm curious." "Then respond. What's the worst that could happen? An awkward conversation with a stranger? Seems worth the risk to satisfy your curiosity." After we hung up, I returned to my laptop and opened the email again. Michael was right. What harm could come from one conversation? Perhaps it would even bring some closure to a chapter of my life I'd never properly finished. "Dear Eliza," I wrote, "thank you for reaching out. Yes, I knew your father many years ago. I would be willing to speak with you about that time in our lives. Perhaps we could arrange a video call." 3 days later, I sat nervously at my desk, waiting for the video call to connect. When Eliza Morrison's face appeared on my screen, I caught my breath. She had Daniel's eyes, the same storm cloud gray, the same intensity. But her smile was unfamiliar, presumably inherited from her mother. "Dr. Walker," she began formally, "thank you for agreeing to speak with me." "Please, call me Caroline," I said. "It's nice to meet you, Eliza, though I admit this is rather surreal." She nodded, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear, another gesture that echoed Daniel. "For me as well. I've been learning about a side of my father I never knew existed." "How much do you know about our history?" I asked cautiously. "Only what I pieced together from his journals and your letters," she replied. "That you met during the summer of 1985, had a long-distance relationship while he was in his residency, and then broke up. He kept your photo, though. This one." She held up a faded photograph to her camera, me at 22, laughing on a beach with windblown hair, squinting against the summer sun. I remembered the day Daniel had taken it. We'd spent hours collecting shells and talking about the marine research I hoped to conduct someday. "He kept that all these years?" I asked, my voice catching. Eliza nodded. "It was in a box with your letters and his journals. Mom never knew about it. They divorced when I was 12. She hesitated. "In his journals, especially the recent ones, he often wondered what became of you, if you'd achieved your dreams of studying ocean conservation." A complicated emotion tightened my chest, sadness mixed with a strange validation. "I did," I said softly. "I've spent my career researching marine ecosystems and advocating for ocean protection." "He would have been pleased to know that," Eliza said. He followed news about climate change and ocean conservation closely. I never understood why, since his work was so far removed from that field, but now it makes sense. We talked for nearly 2 hours. I shared memories of the Daniel I had known, his passion for medicine, his dry humor, his habit of quoting obscure poetry, his gentle way with people. Eliza filled in the decades that followed. His successful career as a cardiologist, his marriage to her mother. a nurse he'd met during his residency, their eventual divorce, his devotion to Eliza and her younger brother, his quiet life in later years. He never remarried after Mom, she said. There were a few relationships, but nothing that lasted. I used to think he was just too focused on his work, but now I wonder. She trailed off, then collected herself. His journal entries about you became more frequent after his heart attack 5 years ago. I think facing his mortality made him reflective. I leaned forward. What did he write, if you don't mind my asking? Eliza reached for something off-screen and returned with a leather-bound journal. May I read you something? When I nodded, she opened to a marked page. This is from 3 years ago. Dreamed of Caroline again last night. We were young, on that beach in Rockport, planning impossible futures. In the dream, I followed her to California, as I'd promised. What would that life have looked like? Would we have weathered the challenges better together than apart? These questions haunt me more as time passes. Not with regret exactly, but with awareness of life's branching paths. I'm proud of my work, grateful for my children, but I still wonder about the road not taken with the woman who understood the ocean's pull. Tears welled in my eyes. The passage revealed a Daniel who had matured beyond the ambitious young doctor I'd known. A man capable of the kind of reflection our younger selves hadn't mastered. And he had remembered my connection to the ocean, how I'd tried to explain that pull to him during our summer together. Thank you for sharing that, I said, when I could trust my voice again. It's strange to think he wondered about me just as I sometimes wondered about him. Did you, Eliza asked, wonder about him, I mean? I nodded slowly. At milestone moments, mostly. When my marriage ended, when I received my first major research grant, when I stood on a beach in Belize watching sea turtles hatch and had no one to share it with who would truly understand what it meant to me. I paused, surprised by my own candor with this stranger who wasn't really a stranger at all. Your father was the first person who ever really listened when I talked about my passion for marine life. That kind of connection leaves a mark. Eliza smiled sadly. He was a good listener. It made him an excellent doctor. She hesitated before continuing. There's something else I wanted to ask you about. In his most recent journal, he mentioned regret over the letter Caroline never read. Do you know what he might have been referring to? The question hit me like a physical blow. The unopened letter I'd thrown away during those dark days after my father's death. What had it contained? What words from Daniel had I rejected in my grief and anger? There was a letter, I admitted. After I ended our relationship, he sent one final letter that I never opened. I was hurting and felt abandoned when he couldn't come to my father's funeral. It wasn't rational, but grief rarely is. Oh, Eliza said softly, that explains it. He wrote about sending you something important after your breakup, something that might have changed everything. He seemed to believe you'd read it and still chosen to cut contact. No, I whispered. I never knew what it said. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of decades-old miscommunication hanging between us. Would you like to know? Eliza finally asked. What was in the letter? I stared at her in confusion. How could anyone know now? Because he kept a copy, she said simply. Or rather, he wrote out what he remembered writing to you. It's in the same journal from his last months. She looked down at the book in her hands. Would it be too difficult to hear it now? Part of me wanted to say yes, to protect myself from words that could reopen wounds long scarred over. But a stronger part needed to know what might have been, even if the knowledge came 4 decades too late. I'd like to hear it, I said. Eliza nodded and turned several pages in the journal. Here it is. He wrote, what I sent to Caroline after she ended things. My dearest Caroline, I understand your anger and disappointment in me. You needed me there with you, and I failed you during the hardest moment of your life. If I could go back and change my choices, I would. Nothing, not my residency, not my patience, nothing should have kept me from being by your side when you laid your father to rest. But there's something you don't know, something I didn't tell you because I didn't want to add to your burden during your grief. My supervising physician suffered a stroke the day after your father died. The hospital was severely short-staffed, and patients in critical condition needed care that few others could provide. I was faced with an impossible choice between personal and professional duty, and I've been tormented by the decision I made. This isn't an excuse, only context I should have shared sooner. I understand if this doesn't change your feelings, but before we go our separate ways permanently, there's something else you should know. I've been offered a position at Stanford Medical Center starting next year. I applied months ago, hoping to surprise you with the news that I could join you in California earlier than we'd planned. If there's any part of you that still sees a future for us, I'll accept the position and we can try again. This time without an ocean between us. I love you, Caroline. Not in the idealistic, untested way of last summer, but in the deeper way that comes from facing challenges and failing and still choosing each other. If you're willing to try again, call me before the end of the month. If not, I'll respect your decision and won't contact you again. Always yours, Daniel. When Eliza finished reading, I covered my face with my hands, overwhelmed by the revelation. Stanford. He had been coming to California after all, and I had never known because I'd thrown away his letter, too hurt and angry to give him a final chance to explain. "I'm sorry," Eliza said gently. "I shouldn't have." "No," I interrupted, lowering my hands. I needed to hear that. All these years, I believed he had chosen his career over our relationship. I never knew about the position at Stanford or his supervisor's stroke. "He took a different position in Boston when he didn't hear from you," Eliza explained. "That's where he met my mother the following year." I nodded, trying to process this alternative history that had nearly been mine. If I'd opened that letter, if I'd called him, would we have built a life together in California? Would Eliza even exist? Or would different children with Daniel's gray eyes have called me mother? "Thank you for sharing this with me," I said finally. "It doesn't change the lives we lived, but it helps me understand closure that never really happened." "He kept track of your work, Eliza said. "I found printouts of several of your research papers in his files, and a newspaper clipping about a conservation award you received in 2012. This revelation was almost as startling as the letter's contents. While I had occasionally searched Daniel's name online over the years, I'd never imagined him doing the same, following my career from afar. "I have a proposal," Eliza said after a moment. "I'm coming to California next month for a conference in San Francisco. Would you be open to meeting in person? There are some things of my father's I think he would have wanted you to have. His journals about you, the photograph, some shells he kept that I believe you collected together." The thought of holding tangible connections to Daniel after so many years was both terrifying and compelling. "Yes," I found myself saying. "I'd like that very much." After we ended the call, I walked down to the beach below my house, a luxury my decades of work had finally afforded me in retirement. The Pacific stretched before me, vast and unchanged despite the years of human drama played out along its shores. I thought about parallel lives and missed opportunities, about the young woman who had been too hurt to open a letter, and the path that choice had set her on. I didn't regret my life, my accomplished career, my 2 wonderful children, the adventure and purpose I'd found in my work. But for the first time, I allowed myself to fully mourn the future that had been offered in that unopened letter. The road not taken, with a man who had apparently held me in his heart until the end of his life. A month later, I met Eliza at a small cafe overlooking the ocean. In person, her resemblance to Daniel was even more striking. Not just her eyes, but certain expressions, the way she gestured when making a point. She brought a small wooden box containing the items she'd mentioned: the photograph, several journals, a collection of shells wrapped in faded tissue paper. "You kept these all these years?" I said wonderingly, running my fingers over the smooth surface of a sand dollar I remembered finding on a morning walk with Daniel. "They meant something to him," Eliza replied. "You meant something to him, even after everything." We spent hours talking about Daniel, yes, but also about our own lives. Eliza was a pediatric surgeon, following in her father's medical footsteps, but choosing a different specialty. She was married with twin daughters. She shared stories of Daniel as a father and grandfather that made me laugh and cry, helping me know the man he'd become after our paths diverged. As our meeting drew to a close, she reached into her bag one last time. "There's one more thing," she said, handing me an envelope with my name written on it in familiar handwriting that had barely changed over 4 decades. He wrote this during his last week, when he knew the end was near. "It's addressed to you." Though I don't think he ever expected you'd read it. I accepted the envelope with trembling hands. "Thank you for finding me," I said, "for sharing him with me again after all this time." "I think he'd be happy we connected," she replied with a smile that reminded me so much of Daniel's that my heart ached, "and I'd like to stay in touch if that's not too strange." "I'd like that too," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. That evening, alone on my deck with the sound of waves breaking below, I carefully opened Daniel's final letter to me. "Dear Caroline, as I write this, the sun is setting over Boston Harbor, and I'm thinking of different sunsets we once watched together. The doctors tell me my heart is failing, which seems fitting somehow. It's been somewhat compromised since that summer of 1985, when a certain marine biology student claimed a permanent piece of it. I don't write to disturb your life or to express regrets. We each walked the paths we were meant to walk. Mine brought me my children, whom I adore, and a career helping others that fulfilled me deeply. From what I've seen of your oppressive work, yours brought you similar satisfaction and purpose. Yet as I face the end of my journey, I find myself returning to thoughts of beginnings, to a young man and woman on a beach, collecting shells and dreaming of saving oceans and healing hearts. We didn't know then how life would separate and reshape us, but I want you to know that the time we shared remains one of my life's most cherished chapters. Perhaps in another universe, we found our way back to each other. Perhaps there's a world where I'm watching the Pacific sunset with you instead of facing the Atlantic alone. I find comfort in that possibility. Wherever you are, whatever joy and sorrow has shaped your life since we parted, I hope you found happiness and purpose. Most of all, I hope you've never stopped feeling the ocean's pull that captivated you and me all those years ago. With enduring affection, Daniel. I held the letter to my chest and looked out at the Pacific, tears streaming down my face. Not tears of regret, but of recognition, of 2 lives that had touched profoundly and then continued on separate shores, connected always by the constancy of the ocean between us. The next morning, I walked along the beach at sunrise, collecting shells as I had done decades earlier with Daniel. I selected the most perfect sand dollar, similar to the one he had kept all those years, and placed it on my windowsill beside the wooden box Eliza had given me. Later that day, I sent Eliza a message, Your father once told me that the ocean doesn't separate shores, it connects them. I think perhaps he was right after all.